Hello. This virtual lecture is about collecting your data, which you would normally expect to do after you've decided what your topic is, after you've done some reading about what other people know about that topic, and after you've worked out what it is that you want to answer. It doesn't always follow that a research project is sequenced exactly like that, and you might set people off to collect data before you've decided finally on what your research questions are going to be. But it isn't a good idea to collect data without really knowing what you're going to do with it and what questions it's going to answer. So do think of data as a part of your research process, but not the only thing that you need to sort out. Again, there are some examples in the textbook of student projects, published projects, theory about data collection and so on, so you can have a look at those at this stage when you're thinking about your own collecting of the data. So when you're identifying data to analyse, remember that you are going to need to think ahead to what you're going to do with it. So there's collecting data and there's analysing data, and if you haven't thought about both parts of the process, you can become a little bit unstuck. So you know what kind of language you're interested in, probably, although it may be that the question is what you've identified and you don't quite know what data will fit that question. So what do you do? What do you do to collect relevant data for a research project? Supposing you've thought about the research project from the point of view of the data. I want to know more about the language of dating ads, or I want to know about whether it is the case that young people generally are using de in words where older people have traditionally used t. Or I've got a real interest in obituaries, and I've noticed that sports people who die are written about in quite a different way from politicians of the same age who've died, so I want to investigate that a bit more. Or, and we've had these topics before, I enjoy stand-up comedy, maybe you perform it, you like watching it, you like some comedians, not others. What is it that makes us laugh? I want to look at the language of stand-up comedy. Something that occurred to me recently, listening to a news story over the summer, because I'm interested in language about animals, was the way badgers get talked about when we are blaming them for cows getting TB, whereas people who support badgers and wildlife and their right to exist talk about badgers in a different way. So how do news reports perhaps show a subtle bias towards the farming interests or towards the environmentalist interests when they talk about something like the claim that badgers are responsible for TB in cows? So you need to think about where you'll get hold of the data if these are the sorts of projects you're interested in, and it could be any one of these. Language of dating ads, fairly obvious. You'll look at either magazines or online dating sites. Well, which will you choose, and what can you find out about this language by going to different sorts of sources? And will you narrow that down in particular ways and say, well, actually what I'm talking about is the language of dating ads in magazines for young women, as opposed to the language of dating ads in the Guardian newspaper, Lonely Arts column. If you're interested in something like these sound patterns, then where are you going to find the kind of instances that you can draw conclusions from? Presumably it's got to be spontaneous speech, not careful speech, or might you compare careful speech and spontaneous speech? Are you going to make new recordings yourself? Are you going to go to online sources where you can find this sort of data, such as interviews from the radio or from TV? Where can you get material which will actually answer the question you've posed? Obituaries tend to be published in newspapers, but if you're interested, for example, in comparing people of different sorts who are talked about in different ways, must it be the same newspapers or could it be different ones? You need to think that through. You might go to YouTube for discourse of stand-up comedy. You might go to live recordings and see whether you can be allowed to record them. Would you use video? Would you just use audio? Where are you going to get this? Would transcripts be good enough since you're interested in the discourse, or do you need all the paralinguistic features and the physical, visual side of stand-up comedy? Perhaps if you wanted to concentrate on the audio, you'd listen to people on the radio rather than people who are performing live or on television. Different newspapers, TV news, radio news, specialist journals, environmentalist journals, farmers' journals. So think through where the kind of data you're interested in is likely to be found, and as you do that you might start to refine your research questions a bit more. So this is what we mean by an iterative sort of process. You start an idea, you polish it up, you move on to the next stage. As you think that through, you go back and say, actually, the question I'm answering is a smaller question than the one I started with, because I'm only looking at data from this source or these two sources. So they can affect each other. Then you need to collect the data, and you need to think through the practicalities. Is it going to be one person's job? Is it going to be a subgroup within the group? Or is it going to be the whole group? You might need some organisation and planning and timekeeping here. So when will you do interviews? When are the people you're hoping to interview likely to be available? Are they going to be willing to do it? If you want recordings from comedy programmes, you're going to need to look in the listings and find out when they are, or sort out your iPlayer and work out what's available and for how long. You might need access to newspapers from a certain date, as in when the TB bovine badger controversy was live, or which might be a particular time in a particular month. Or you might want to do something diachronic and look back at newspapers from the 1960s or the 1970s. What do we have in the library? What can you get online? So you need to follow that up, and if you find there's a certain sort of data you really can't get access to, you might need to change your question or change your focus a little bit. And that's where a pilot can be useful, making sure that what you plan to do is actually feasible and can be done in the time you've got available. So if you thought there were particular sorts of data online, and then you go and look and you find actually it's not there, or it's only very limited, or you can only get transcripts, you can't get the original sound recordings, then at least you found out now and not when you've planned the whole project in detail. So checking that you can actually collect the data is an important stage of designing a research project. Remember good housekeeping. This is something to bear in mind all the time. Keep records, keep a journal of the whole process, and your blog on the website is a very good way of sharing this and making sure it's up to date. And do back up your data. If you're using digital files in any way, don't just have one copy. If you found particular hard copy texts, again, make photocopies. Don't just have one source of this stuff, because if it gets coffee spilt on it, or if somebody loses their data stick, or the cat runs off with it, you're really sunk. So backup copies of your data are really, really important. Keep everyone informed of what you're doing. This is one of the ways in which group work can either succeed or fail. Somebody goes off and collects a certain type of data, and little do they know, because they haven't communicated well, that someone else has been doing exactly the same thing, and you've got cross wires and someone thought you were doing something else. So do share your resources around the group, keep each other informed, use the blog to keep each other informed of what you're doing. Bear in mind what you know already from your reading, so think about how your data set fits in with the kind of data sets that other people have written about, so you're following in the footsteps of people who've done something similar, probably on a larger scale than you can do it, and probably in more detail with more sophistication than you can do it so far, but they do provide models for you of how to do the data collection. And also do think ahead to what you're going to be doing with the data, analysing it, presenting your findings. It's really easy to collect so much data that you then feel you're drowning and you don't know what to do with it, and you start thinking, I can't do this research because I've just got so many bits and pieces of material to analyse that I'm never going to be able to do it, or we're never going to be able to do it, even as a group. So do think about what you need to answer the questions and how you're going to answer those questions, so that with data analysis you don't have a sudden shock about what to do with everything you've collected. As before, I'll show you a few examples from some published studies. Think about how you would represent to the other people in the group, and when you do this individually in your own assignment, what you collected in a clear visual way. So for example, this is a corpus study, and the author of the study, it doesn't really matter what it was about, but they explain to the reader, these were the corpora I used, this is how many words is in each one of them, this is what the total number of words is, and it's neatly laid out there. You don't need to take a lot of words to fill all that in with I used the Cambridge da 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 da, and that included so many 100,000 running words. If you do it like this, you save yourself words, and you also do the reader a favour, because it's very clear to see what data were used in this project. This is the Olympic sports gender difference study that I mentioned in the lecture on research questions. So how did we look into whether male athletes and female athletes were talked about differently in different sports? We recorded this many hours of this kind of coverage during this period, and we actually tried to get 100% of NBC's scheduled coverage. So it wasn't a sample, wasn't picking certain programmes. We took everything they broadcast in prime time about the Olympics, and that's what we used. You couldn't possibly do something on a scale like that, but you could say, I've used 2 extracts from so-and-so's stand-up routine broadcast on the radio, which station, at what time, and how many minutes that is, how many words that amounts to, and so on. And think about, again, how you could present it visually so that the reader understands at a glance what your data actually consisted of. And then, as I say, knowing what to do with the data once you've got it is something to think through from as early on as you can. Are you going to transcribe some speech? If so, how will you do this? What transcription conventions will you use? Are you going to turn text files into some sort of corpus format? There is information on the wiki about how to do this and how to use computer programs like AntConc and Wordsmith tools. I'm not saying you have to do this, but if you're going to do it, it's a stage in the process, and you need to allow time to do it, and you need to learn how to do it if you don't already know, and there is information about that on the wiki. If you've collected questionnaires, then are you going to collate them and write down all the answers to question 1, all the answers to question 2? Are you going to code them? If you've used magazines that different group members are going to approach with different questions in mind, then you'll need to make multiple copies and think about marking them up, perhaps using highlighter pens, or keeping some other sort of log of what it is that you're doing with them. And that obviously takes you straight into the next stage of doing a research project, which is when you've collected your data, or even while you're collecting first parts of your data, you can start thinking about interpreting and analysing it, and that's moving on towards the last stage of the project before you have to present it to other people, and you'll hear about that next time.